3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3. I don't know why I counted the other way. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody back to Dungeon Brew. God, what are we even doing? Welcome everybody back to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our series on monster tactics. Today we're going to be talking about dragons. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back everybody to Dungeon Brew. John and I are talking about dragons today for our monster tactics series. This is probably a long-awaited video that some of you guys were hoping that we were going to be doing. I'm excited to dive right into it. John, dragons is actually a very broad strokes across a lot of different monsters that can be found through multiple editions and multiple books. Where would you like to get started?
Okay, so I want to qualify what we're intending to cover here. We're talking about true dragons, in the sense that these are the six-limbed creatures, 4 legs, 2 wings. We're not talking about the dragons that only have 4 legs. We're not talking about like wyverns. We're just talking about the DnD chromatic metallic dragons, and to some degree we're extending that into gem dragons and other ones that have been created, but we're not talking about specific dragons. I think we're going to do a series of shorts probably that will delve into some of the specific dragons, but we're just talking broadly about dragons during this video because there's so much to cover. I just don't want to try and promise too much for what it is that we want to talk about, but these are general rules or general tactics that you can use for dragons to make the fight challenging and enjoyable. And I think that that's a very distinct and important thing to talk about when it comes to fights with dragons, because they can be exceptionally difficult, and depending on your party's ability or experience with fighting creatures like this, it can feel bad from a player perspective fighting a dragon that the DM just decides that they're gonna really give their party a hard time with.
I mean, because we're going to be honest about it, dragons are intelligent creatures. In fact, they're
Right.
probably more intelligent than the GM that's trying to represent them in the course of the battle that's taking place. And if a dragon wanted to, they're going to be able to use skills in order to just wipe out the party 9 times out of 10, unless they're just fighting very young dragons at high levels. But by the time that you are facing a full-fledged ancient dragon on the battlefield, I think that you mentioned this pretty well before we got started. Like, you almost have to give yourself an allowance as a GM to not go full throttle with the dragon, so that the heroes can feel heroic, unless you're just wanting to party wipe them.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a very delicate balance of, I want this to be challenging, I want this to be difficult. I don't want to just rub my players' characters into the mud. Like, I just don't want to completely trounce them. And it's actually easier to do that than you might think with dragons if you're using them in an intelligent way. I do want to say one thing though, because you did mention dragon intelligence. There's some variability here, depending on the type of dragon. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to that stat when you're looking at the dragon you're intending to employ. By and large, white dragons are more animalistic. They're more hunters. They're more predators. Whereas some of the other dragons are going to be very high on the intelligence scales. I mean, green dragons are notoriously cunning and difficult to deal with because of their high intelligence. So pay attention to those things.
I knew you were going to throw shade at the white dragon. You weren't even going to mention any other. You're just going to be like, the white dragon is dumb.
It's not that they're dumb. They're more instinctual. They're more animalistic, just in that sense. And that has its own kind of threat. Like, there's the intelligence that comes from a green or a red dragon, where they have this cunning, they want to play with their food type of a situation. And then you have the white dragon that is, it smells blood and it goes as hard as it can at the weakest member of the party because it's looking for a meal. It doesn't really care about anything else. So what it wants to do is charge in there, kill one of them, grab the body, and fly away, which is a different kind of terrible. So those are the things that I think that we want to explore a little bit. But like I said, we'll get into specific dragon tactics in some of the shorts that we're intending to do.
All right, so yeah, so we are talking for the sake of this video. We're talking about 6 limbs, so 4 legs, 2 wings, dragons of whatever size. I know that I am pretty old school in thinking about just them in 2 groups, like the metallic dragons and the chromatic dragons. I don't really know much about gym dragons. I'll be honest with you. There's certain dragons in newer editions that I'm just not as familiar with, or I haven't used as much. With them specifically, so I'm probably going to lean towards just referencing the ones that I'm more familiar with playing with. But overall, I typically think of dragons as having a lair or an area where they are fighting and they're protecting, that they utilize, and that's where I've seen most combats take place with dragons in the course of gameplay, unless it's going to be like them out raising the land or attacking a city where the players are caught underneath it. And I don't know your experience, John, but I usually see adventurers going out and seeking a dragon to fight them in their home environment or their lair, outside of fighting them in open ground.
Yeah. So, and really, I mean, you've nailed the two instances of when do you encounter a dragon? The dragon is on the hunt, or the dragon is in its lair. That's pretty much it. And so I feel like we'll capture maybe those 2 things separately. On the hunt, that is when the dragon is weaker, right? The dragon does not have the benefit of its lair actions while it's out flying around. However, the dragon definitely has the ability for mobility a lot more. Presumably because if things are going poorly, they're just going to be out. And that is a tactic that I think most GMs do not use well enough, and it's something that they need to be aware of, because dragons did not get to be as old as they are by fighting to the death every time that they encounter an enemy or an opponent that's dangerous. This is the same thing, and we've talked about this kind of throughout the Tactics series, that morale is very important to make a believable and interesting fight. And it's just as true for dragons as it is for anything else. Many dragons, particularly like red dragons, have that pride factor associated with them where they always think they're superior. But the red dragon is not going to fight to the death to prove that it's better. It's going to be, this is a waste of my time anyway, and just leave. There's no reason to continue. So dragon fights out in open areas. The dragons use their elevation. They use their height. They have excellent eyesight. They're going to be able to locate what it is that they want to target. So they might attack the PCs on the road if they're aware that the PCs have magical items, or they look weak, or they look vulnerable, they're not paying attention. They're going to take advantage the same way that anyone else would, whether that's a bandit or a predator or anything else, and they're going to do it from a distance that's difficult to see. I kind of think of the Nazgul flying on the fell beasts in Tolkien, where only Legolas is able to spot them way up in the dark sky. Nobody else can see them. That's the kind of situation we're talking about. We're talking about very high perception checks to be able to locate the dragon way up in the sky, to give any warning that this thing is anywhere nearby before it decides it's going to attack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm thinking of a third option here as well, which could potentially take place. We do know that our chromatic dragons can shapeshift into humanoids, so there is the case that they could be shapeshifted to and be found out during the course of their interactions with others in the populace. That there could be an encounter, but that's probably less rare.
Well, and the shape-shifting thing is really something that I see a lot more in older editions. It's not really something that they talk about a ton in 5th edition. I think there's a couple of dragons that mention that they have it. But for example, in Krynn, in the Dragonlance setting, pretty much all the dragons always shapeshift all the time. They have a tendency to, if they want to infiltrate, if they want to hide what they are pretty much always shapeshifted into a humanoid form of some kind. And I think that that's something that you can easily employ. It's something that you can definitely just give the dragons the ability to do that. There's no reason why you have to limit that. And this is generally true about all the monsters that we talk about all the time. Adding in abilities makes the fights way more interesting than just letting them be by the books. Because, especially for veteran players who have been around the block a few times, or veteran players that are veterans of 5th edition, going to older editions, pulling on things that they haven't seen before, can make fights really interesting and engaging. And I'm just going to go ahead and go on my rant here, if you don't mind, Joshua.
I was going to say, do you have some specific things from older editions?
Yeah, I have a list of things for dragons. And what I'll do is I'll put some of this stuff, I'll put notes up here so you guys can pause and look at a little bit more detail, because I'm going to talk broadly about them. But I don't want to spend 20 minutes going, line by line on what it is that I have. Some of these things that were in older editions have been pulled into 5th edition. Things like their tail hit, their wing buffet, those types of things are still things that you can use or are part of the dragon repertoire in 5th edition. Generally speaking, they're things that usually fall into like legendary actions. In previous editions, these were part of their normal attack sequences, and it had a lot more to do with like location. So if you have an enemy behind you, or if there's an enemy behind the dragon, they could just use their tail slap as part of their normal attack sequence. One of the other ones that they could use as part of their normal attack sequence was their kick ability, which is basically just taking a hind leg and donkey kicking one of the PCs and trying to send them flying back as far as you can, potentially knocking them prone, which is always fun. I think that this is really cool when it comes to the dragon on the ground. In 5th edition is always at its weakest, because it gets surrounded, everybody can reach it, they just waylay on it. And giving it additional attacks once it hits the ground makes it more deadly. And the neat thing about it is that all of the attacks don't have to be focused towards the front. Some of them can be towards the rear, where other people or other PCs are closing the distance. It spreads damage out to the entire party a little bit, and it also gives the dragon just kind of some more options as far as those go. And then there are 2 other ones. One is its plummet ability. The plummet ability is basically the dragon is flying along, it sees people, and it just drops on top of them, pinning multiple PCs to the ground depending on the size of the dragon, at which point it's initiating basically like a grapple check. So it will come down and grapple and then restrain PCs, where it will then use its claws or its bite attacks in order to rake at it or try to attack it or kill it in some way. So that's a really fun option. And then the other one is the snatch ability, which is basically kind of along the same lines, where it comes down, it grabs a PC, flies up in the air, and then drops them, which is also pretty fun. Or it can plummet from a snatch position, so it grabs a PC, flies up in the air, and then basically body slams it to the ground. So these are all these are all just different things that you can do with a dragon that I think for the most part you can just match the normal damage given for claw attacks, bite attacks. You don't really have to change those numbers up a whole lot. For 5th edition, I would just reference what's already in the stat block for 90% of this stuff, and just allow them to have other things that they can do, give them additional attacks, allow them to spread out damage, and include more of these things, more of these options, particularly if you have a dragon that is facing off against a larger party, so a party of 5 or 6 players. Definitely give them some more options, because that gives them the ability to have more action economy, potentially, than they would normally have. All right, yeah. I'm done with my rant.
No, it's a really good rant. As you're talking, I'm thinking about how even the game Skyrim brought back a lot of those potential pieces into the mechanics of how the video game works that you see. And I wonder how many people try to incorporate those things, but then you get to the stat block in a tabletop role-playing game using the dragon, and you got your 2 claws in your bite attack, essentially, for most of them, and you don't see the opportunity to have the dragon kind of take this this presence on the battlefield like you see in some of the games that you play, and you're trying to find ways to actually incorporate that. And I think what you're sharing allows you to bring yourself to a place of utilizing a dragon much like you would see in that game.
It's been a long time since I played it, so I'm trying to recall.
Well, they don't pick up creatures and drop them, but they do lane on the creatures. They do blow them back. You're allowed to, they do use their tail attacks. There's all those things that do occur during the course of the game.
Yeah, and I mean the wing buffet is still something that occurs. Some of these things can be thrown into legendary actions so that you're not over bloating the action economy for the dragon for smaller parties. So things like plummet or snatch, kick, throw those into your legendary action sequence potentially, rather than your normal attack sequence if you only have a party of 3 or 4. When you have a larger party, 5, 6, whatever, then you start adding these in as part of their normal attack sequence. But the point is to try and match the number of attacks that's basically going on in the party, because that is really the secret of balance in 5th edition, is action economy. And that's how players get overwhelmed, is when more attacks or more actions are occurring from their enemy than they have to expend, because they don't have the ability to out-heal or overcome the amount of damage that's basically coming from an enemy of some kind.
And I'll tell you, I mean, let's just put it out on the table. We had a dragon fight earlier this week that I ran, and I failed miserably in executing this. And honestly, as I've been looking more at action economy, that is where I failed at. Even though we were in a lair, and I had lair actions, and I had legendary actions, I put the dragon in a place that didn't give it great mobility to respond to the party, and the party's action economy was far greater than what the dragon's was. And I didn't give the dragon additional minions in the course of the boss battle to help balance that. So it ended up being the party just waylaying on the dragon and murdering him before he could cast a spell, before he could get off a breath weapon. Like, it ended up being a fairly short battle, which did not have a great balance of fun and challenge. It ended up being, I think, probably a lot of fun for the party, but from the GM standpoint, I was like, you guys just murdered the boss, and that was not much of a challenge for you guys.
Right, and that's the thing. Like, dragon fights basically end up, most of the time, they end up in one of two ways. One is that the party curb stomps the dragon. The other is that the dragon curb stomps the party. And it really comes down to action economy, the CR level of the dragon, and then the ability of the GM to make use of the mobility of the dragon. So when you're designing a lair for your dragon, we talked about being on the road. On the road, you have the high mobility of the dragon. It can fly away. There shouldn't be any restrictions. It can go up into the sky and just leave if it needs to. When it's in its own lair, oftentimes the GM has a tendency to let the dragon just go land in the middle of its lair and then try and brawl with the party. And this is not good for the dragon. This is why one of their base abilities in terms of their legendary actions is their wing buffet ability, because that gives them the opportunity to knock everybody down and back out of the fight, which they should be doing very regularly. This is almost like the way that they operate. They go in, they land, they do their attacks. As soon as they have the opportunity for a legendary action, hit their wings, back out of the fight, and get to a high ground that is not easily accessible by most of the party, especially the fighters, barbarians, etc. This is kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of the video, though, in terms of when does a dragon fight become less fun for the party because it's too challenging. And this is the kind of tactic that we can point to, because the party then has the issue of, if you have fighters that only have melee weapons, or you have a bunch of the big brawler types that only have the melee weapons, they're going to get really frustrated by this because they can never close the distance with the dragon, and so they feel like they spend all of their time running around in circles or trying to take cover or do something else. So you have to kind of balance that back and forth. If you end up in a place where the dragon is really overcoming the party quite well, the players are getting frustrated because they can't touch the dragon because you're too smart with it. You're gonna have to make some mistakes from the dragon's perspective. It's just kind of an unfortunate reality of the dragon and the way that it plays, is that it has to do certain things, or the way that it does things does make it to where the particular party you're facing may not be capable of dealing with them on an equal footing. It really has to do you have archers? Do you have magic users? Do you have clerics? Do you have those ranged damage types that are actually going to be able to harm the dragon from a distance? If the party doesn't have that, the dragon has to brawl at some point for the party to stand any chance, because as a GM, you can always keep your distance, use breath weapons, close the distance, get a couple attacks in, wing buff it out, and they will never be able to touch the dragon realistically, which is just an unfortunate reality and something that the GM is responsible for balancing throughout that fight.
I want to add one more area where the GM can balance here too, and that's giving the party magical items that allow them to close that distance, whether it's going to be a shadow jump or a misty step or something that allows them to be able to engage with the dragon or the beast. And I'll be honest, in my early years of GMing, I failed at this pretty miserably, where I wouldn't give the party the right types of tools they needed for the fights that I was introducing to them, or I gave them too many tools for the fight I was introducing to them, so they were able to just stomp whatever creature I was putting out there. And this isn't specific to dragons, but it's just knowing that as a GM, you have to make sure that you're balancing the magic items you're giving to your party for the fights that you're introducing to allow them to have more versatility in that fight, especially if you're going to be using some of the tactics that you've been talking about, John, on how you can use the dragon specifically to do all these additional things for action economy. If you're going to introduce those, think about how the party is going to be able to respond to those based on what you're providing for them.
And I gotta say, there's nothing more frustrating as a GM than giving your party the tools necessary to deal with, it could be a dragon or any other challenge, and them going, well, I don't want to use this. This is just vendor trash. And they go sell it or get rid of it. And you're like, okay, so now you're going to fight a dragon. Too bad that you sold your dragon slaying sword and you got rid of your arrow of dragon slaying. That's unfortunate. I guess you guys are just fighting it in the buff. Which happens more often than I want to realize, but it definitely is a thing that occurs. So, that you can give them the tools, but ultimately it's up to the party to use them effectively, and there's really only so much that you can do in certain regards. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think here, just in terms of other things. I think broadly we've kind of talked about a lot of the tactics that can make a dragon very effective. It's mostly just kind of paying attention to not being too effective, and like I said, we'll do a series of shorts here that will talk about specific dragons and some of the specific tactics that you can enjoy or employ to make them more interesting individually.
And I think that's probably the only thing that I have left to add on this video, which is going to be more detailed in those shorts. But just recognize that dragons have individual traits and personalities that make them unique, and they got to fit within the story that's being told. And they also have their own alignments as well. You know, your metallic dragons are going to be good aligned. Your chromatic dragons are typically evil aligned. Now, you can change this for your own game if you want to and mix up the rules, flip the script. But typically, these are going to be dragons that are going to engage with parties that are either confronting them on some sort of motivation or pursuance of some goal that's not coherent or congruent, and they are, or they're going to be opposite aligned, and that's why they're fighting with each other. It would be confusing to have a gold dragon go and attack a good aligned party just for no reason.
Right. All right, so that's the dragon video. We appreciate you guys all sticking around as long as you did. If you have any comments or anything like that, if you have any memorable dragon fights, please put those down in the comments below. We'd love to read about them. And if you have not already, please give us a like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell to help support the channel, and we will see you next time.
Judge and Crew.